General Hospital spoilers for Wednesday, May 28 reveal that Dante and Brook Lynn stand before Joe's door as if facing a trial, one with no judge, no lawyer, no transcripts, no defense, only the past, remorse, and a pain that has lingered for years, a pain neither of them has ever truly dared to confront. The journey that brought them here was not merely physical, it was a tortured return to the depths of what they had buried in their hearts. A lost child, a blood bond never acknowledged, and years that seemed settled but are now stirred by an unnameable nightmare, the truth. They are not arriving as parents who once nurtured, protected, and loved Gio from the start. They come as outsiders, pushed out of their child's life by time and selfish choices. And that is precisely what makes the old wooden door before them a symbol of a fragile threshold, between opportunity and punishment. Once it opens, they will step into a world where every question they once avoided will demand an answer, not through words, but through glances, silence, and the reaction of a son who has never been called by the name he deserves, family. Dante, the man who once swore to be a better father than his own, can no longer hide the weight in his eyes. For years, he convinced himself that silence was a form of protection, that not unearthing the past would make things better for everyone. But now, as the truth about Gio is laid bare, he realizes that silence wasn't just avoidance, it was complicity in a loss. He remembers all the hours spent in the investigation room, flipping through case files and evidence, seeking justice for others, while his own child grew up with no one to stand by him. He had been a cop, a warrior, a hero, everything except a father. Brook Lynn, standing beside him, fares no better. She carries with her 1,000 justifications. That she was too young, that her career was unfinished, that her family held her back. But now, those excuses are nothing more than a fragile facade that Joe's gaze could shatter in an instant. The years spent in the limelight, at press conferences, chasing a dream of fame, now feel hollow and extravagant when placed next to the irrefutable truth. She had given up on her child, or worse, never truly tried to keep him. Gio, the man behind the door, was the boy left behind, who lived among questions with no answers, who looked in the mirror and wondered why that face resembled no one he knew. He grew up, succeeded, survived, but he hasn't forgiven. He hasn't forgotten. And most frightening of all, he has learned how to live without them. He built a life where Dante and Brook Lynn had no place, and now they come, suddenly, as if a few words of explanation could erase years of silence. But the truth doesn't work with remorse. It works with consequences. And now, as Dante lifts his hand to knock, even he doesn't know whether that door will open with compassion, or slam shut with all the fury Gio has long buried. Brook Lynn, her eyes brimming with tears, says nothing. She knows this isn't the time to speak. This is the time to listen, whether the response is cold silence, a scornful look, or an eruption of rage that will never forgive them. This story is no longer a journey to reclaim a son. It's a confrontation with themselves. And when that door opens, if it opens, everything will change. None of the three will walk away from that moment the same. Because secrets have been exposed, years have been named, and relationships once presumed dead are now laid bare, not under a surgeon's knife, but through memory, tears, and a rage that will never fully fade. Port Charles won't hear about this reunion through headlines or news reports. But it will reverberate silently through the families of this town, where love is sometimes not enough to save, but always enough to make people keep trying. And if Gio opens the door, even just a crack, maybe what he needs to see isn't remorse, but truth, that they never gave up. Even if it's too late. They still came. Elsewhere, on a bleak afternoon at the Metro Court, Nina sits quietly with a cup of cold coffee, her eyes vacant, lost in a maze of wrong choices, simmering betrayals, and pain too heavy to hide. When Maxi approaches, Nina lifts her head only slightly, lips pressed tightly in a silent effort to appear composed, but the exhaustion is etched deep into her gaze. This is no longer a casual conversation between two women who once shared the same whirlwind of career and family. It is a silent cry for help, one Nina has never voiced. Because now, what she's facing has gone beyond scandal, beyond the control of an editor-in-chief who once manipulated Port Charles media, it's become a psychological crisis she can no longer untangle alone. Maxi, sharp and intuitive, doesn't need many words. She knows Nina is in the eye of a storm more complex than any she's ever faced. Not just because her affair with Drew has been exposed, but because of Michael's terrifying counterstrike, the man Nina once underestimated, now steadily becoming an unpredictable force. Nina confesses to Maxi that she doesn't just feel under siege by public opinion, but eroded daily by invisible pressure from both sides, Michael, cold and calculating, and Drew, the former ally who now feels like a storm sweeping her away from herself. What Nina shares isn't just frustration. It's the unraveling psyche of a woman slowly losing control of her own life. She's been too accustomed to winning, through strategy, persuasion, or even pity. But this time, there's no victory waiting. She feels trapped in a labyrinth where every path leads to failure. If she stays with Drew, she becomes the face of betrayal. If she leaves, she loses the only man who understood her after Sunny. And in between, there's Michael. Saying little, but whose every move feels like a surgical cut to the delicate web Nina once spun to protect herself. Maxi listens, without judgment. Then, Nina reaches out, grabbing her hand for the first time, silently pleading. Not for forgiveness, but for companionship. Nina cannot keep fighting alone. She needs Maxi, not just as a friend, but as the keeper of her final hope, the one who might still see a way out when everything else is collapsing. Because Nina can feel something worse is coming, Michael doesn't just want revenge. He wants to destroy her image entirely, drown her in her own mistakes, and use that collapse to forge a darker, more ruthless version of himself, one who won't stop until she's erased from every power circle in Port Charles. And worst of all, Drew seems to be letting it happen. The man who once convinced Nina they were fighting the world together now feels distant, cold, removed. Maxi realizes. Nina is caught between two forces, and neither is on her side. At that moment, Nina hands Maxi a file, sensitive documents, recordings, and a bitter plea. If one day I can't control this anymore, do the right thing. But don't let me be erased like I never existed. It's the final act of a woman backed into a corner, with no choice left but to trust someone one last time. Maxi, stunned and overwhelmed, understands that what she's holding is more than a secret. It's a ticking bomb that could reshape the city. And when she looks at Nina again, she no longer sees an ambitious woman, but a fractured soul, waiting for a hand to pull her back from the edge she built herself. In that aching silence, Port Charles remains unaware that a new chapter is beginning, one where Nina is no longer leading, but a trembling pawn awaiting someone else's move. And Maxi, in just one afternoon, has become the bearer of a truth that could determine the fate of not only Nina, but also Michael, Drew, and the fragile balance they're all desperately trying to protect. When Michael Corinthos returned to Port Charles after a long period of withdrawal due to injury and personal collapse, he didn't return as a triumphant hero or a refugee begging for forgiveness. He returned like a quiet storm. Hidden beneath calm gestures, rushed greetings, and silent embraces. His family gathered around him, Carly, Jason, Willow, and others who had once been close, now distant. But behind every glance, every voice, and every expression of concern was a silent tension tightening around Michael's heart, pushing him step by step toward a new edge of himself, an edge with no space left for soft emotions or blind trust. From the moment he stepped into the house that had once been a fortress for his soul, Michael sensed something unnamed had changed. The air no longer carried the warmth of a family welcoming their son home. Instead, it reeked of worry, of unspoken questions, of a broken past hidden under well-crafted lies and strained smiles. Carly held his hand as if trying to transfer some unspoken reassurance, but her gaze wavered whenever he brought up custody of Wiley and Amelia. Jason remained silent, but that silence was no longer rooted in unwavering trust. It was measured, like he was calculating which side of the power game Michael now stood on. Willow, once his strongest emotional anchor, now seemed unsure of how to face him. She stood just far enough to feel safe, just close enough not to seem indifferent. But that very distance cut deepest of all. It wasn't an immediate pain, but one that made it crystal clear, she was no longer a place he could place his trust. The betrayal wasn't in grand actions, but in her silence when he was isolated, when the whole town turned its back on him during his weakest moments. And in that silence, the haunting transformation began within Michael. He was no longer the man who believed love could fix everything. No longer the son who tried to piece together his broken family with patience and goodwill. The losses had been too great, the wounds too deep, and trust had been betrayed too many times. A new survival instinct began to form inside him, no longer rooted in emotion, but in power. He no longer sought agreement, he built influence so that no one would dare turn their back on him again. While his family floundered, unsure how to handle his return, Michael was already making strategic moves behind the scenes. He replaced his legal team, firing those who had failed to secure custody for him. He began restructuring investments, moving shares away from Aurora Media into shell companies beyond Drew's reach. He didn't discuss this with Carly or share it with Jason, because now Michael understood, strength didn't come from sharing, it came from total control. No one could intervene if no one knew. This change wasn't explosive rage, it was like a slow-melting glacier, revealing sharp, hidden edges within Michael no one had ever seen. He began watching everyone more closely. Who supported him, who stayed silent, who kept their distance, all were noted. There were no accusations, but there were lists. No threats, but contingency plans. Michael no longer needed affection, he needed position. Not as a member of the family, but as the one who redefined its boundaries. Each night, as Port Charles slept, Michael sat alone in the room once filled with children's laughter, now silent, his planning room. He reopened files on key figures in the family. Carly, Jason, Drew, Willow, and began to analyze. Who had something to lose, who could be swayed, who could be used as a stepping stone. He no longer hesitated. Doubt had burned away with betrayed trust. Now, he was someone else, quiet, calculating, and utterly unrelenting. The changes Michael was making weren't temporary, they were the foundation of a long-term strategy, to place himself back at the center of power. He didn't need love, only fear. So long as no one dared stand against him, he would win. And if removing someone from the board was necessary, he wouldn't flinch. Because now, Michael understood, family isn't always ally. And love isn't always enough to reclaim what was stolen. By the time Port Charles realizes Michael didn't return to reconcile, but to restructure, it will be too late. He'll already be exactly where he needs to be. And the Michael who was once broken, once cast into the shadows, is now using that very shadow to conceal the eyes of a man about to seize control, his heart no longer a place for forgiveness. Chase entered the room with hesitation in every step, eyes heavy with something unspoken, something that had weighed on him since the shocking truth about Joe's parentage was revealed. No longer rumors, no longer buried questions or silent secrets hidden behind the curtains of the past. Now, the truth was undeniable, Brook Lynn is Joe's biological mother. For Chase, that wasn't just a revelation, it was a rupture, shaking the foundations of every feeling and belief he had built with the woman he loved and stood by through so many trials. Brook Lynn, the woman he once saw as honest, impulsive at times but always sincere, now appeared to him as a painful enigma. How could she hide something so monumental? How could she walk beside him every day, build a future with him, while her flesh and blood son grew up alone, unacknowledged? Chase had faced many surprises in life, but never had he felt so betrayed, so wounded. Because this wasn't just a secret, it was someone's life. A part of a family history from which he'd been shut out, with no explanation. He wanted to speak, he had to, but didn't know where to begin. Not out of rage, but because within that anger also lived regret, sorrow, and fear. He feared that if he spoke, it would shatter everything. That his words might ignite a change too devastating to reverse, and leave no path back to what they once had. But he also knew that silence would kill what little remained, inside him, and inside Brook Lynn. So Chase had no choice but to face it. He walked to where Brook Lynn sat, eyes fixed on the screen but clearly lost in thought. When he spoke, it wasn't with anger, but a quiet tremble, each word a cut. Why didn't you trust me enough to share that? Why did you carry that secret alone, all those years? Brook Lynn turned to him, lips trembling, but her eyes were steely, as if she had been waiting for this moment all along. And she had. Because both she and Chase knew this wasn't just a lover's quarrel. It was a turning point in the entire narrative of the Quartermaine family, the Falconerys, and Port Charles itself. The truth about Geo wasn't just changing their relationship. It was reshaping everything. From power dynamics within the family to trust between soulmates. Their conversation didn't end in tears, nor in forgiveness. It ended in silence, a silence thick with pressure, where both knew neither of them was who they once were. Chase would never look at Brook Lynn the same. And she would no longer find safety in his embrace as before. That moment, when two people realize that no matter how right the truth may be, it can still destroy everything, became a defining rupture. Not just in their love, but in the entire fragile web of a family now fracturing from the inside. Geo, once a hidden figure, is now the emotional epicenter of a storm pulling in everyone tied to him. And in that storm, Chase, the man who once thought he held the rhythm of Brook Lynn's heart, has become a stranger, lost among the shards of a past he was never allowed to know. This change is inevitable. Because when a child is denied, the whole world pays the price through the collapse of everything once thought unshakable. And Chase, though he never wanted to, is beginning to understand. Some words come too late. And what remains, is a silence no one has the strength to hold again. Willow is entering a period where everything around her is in disarray, and she, once the center of Port Charles's stability and gentleness, is caught in a cycle of conflicting calculations and unimaginable pressure. While she still appears to be a loving mother, a dedicated nurse, and a woman trying to keep her family together, deep down Willow is realizing that everything she thought she had, custody, love, and a place in the community, is being shaken to pieces by the political, emotional, and power-driven moves of the men around her. Since Michael's return to town, the atmosphere in Willow's life has changed dramatically. His cold stare, his thoughtful silence, and his distance are just enough to keep her from knowing what he's thinking, but close enough to know he hasn't let go. Willow senses that Michael is back not just for Wiley and Amelia, but for something bigger, control. And she is unwillingly drawn into the middle of that campaign. One of her newfound assets is the image of a stable mother, a woman who has built a new family with Drew, and who is trusted by the legal system. But Willow knows that if she's not careful, all of that can become a double-edged sword, used against her when secrets are revealed. Drew, who was once her shoulder to lean on during Michael's absence, is now drifting apart. Not because he doesn't love her, but because he's lost in a series of calculations that are more personal than a true connection to Willow. The secret meetings, the unannounced legal decisions, the fleeting glances he makes whenever he mentions Michael. All of it makes Willow realize that she's no longer a priority in Drew's plans. And what's more troubling is that Drew seems to be using her as part of a plan to gain custody of their children, not out of love, but out of power. In this struggle, Willow is facing one of the biggest questions of her life. Is she becoming a pawn in the game of two men who have loved her in different ways? And if she doesn't make a choice soon, will she lose everything, including her own life? Part of Willow wants to protect her current home, but another, deeper part is starting to wonder if her love for Drew is truly solid, or just a result of her weakness in the moment she lost Michael. Port Charles is starting to stir as rumors of new legal action by Michael spread. And in the halls of the courthouses and the lawyers' offices, people began to question whether Willow was truly in control, or was she also being manipulated by a more complex maelstrom of power than she had ever encountered. The rights she had, from custody to public support, were no longer a given, but a burden. The more she had, the more she had to lose. Willow knew she needed to make a change. A strategic move not just to protect her children, but to protect herself from the impending collapse. She began to rethink her legal arrangements, demanding to meet with her attorney alone, and especially to distance herself from Drew during discussions about Michael. This was no longer a time to rely on emotion. This was a time to live with sobriety. And if necessary, Willow was ready to do what she had never thought possible. Confront both Michael and Drew, not out of resentment, but for her own survival and the survival of her children. Willow's future is no longer determined by love, but by the wise choices she makes among the forces that surround her. And it is in that moment, as she sits alone by the window of the Quartermaine mansion, her gaze fixed on the distance, that Port Charles will understand, Willow is no longer the weak woman she once was. She is changing. And that change, once it explodes, will reshape the entire situation between Michael, Drew, and everyone who thought she would stay silent forever.